I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. Most of us believe we make our rational choices, but our brains are actually wired to say no before we get to the logic. Paul Larche, a Hall of Fame broadcaster and author of The Divided Brain, spent 4 decades in media before turning to neuroscience to find out why customers actually buy. He joins us to break down the old brain versus new brain metaphor and how leaders can stop accidentally triggering the wrong response in their brand storytelling. My interview with Paul is coming right up. But first, Paul Larche, welcome to On Brand.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick. I'm a big fan of yours.
Well, thank you. And I have to admit, I'm a little self-conscious here with your decades in the high stakes world of radio, and here I am in the audio medium myself. So I hope I'm doing my best radio voice for you today.
Well, full disclosure, I've been in radio for, pushing 50 years since I started when I was 15 years old. But I was an announcer only for the first few years of my career. Then I got into that dreaded management side of it and then ownership. So if people are expecting me to sound like their favorite radio DJ from the 80s and 90s, they are going to be sorely disappointed.
So on that note, how did being a media pioneer in radio it set up where you ended up going in your latest act of neuroscience and the modern customer?
Well, like I said, it goes back to when I first started out in radio. I was very young. I worked for another company. I'm from north of Toronto, and I was in Northern Ontario at the time where I was born. And I eventually got into station management and the sales side of radio advertising, because radio is run by the advertising business. It's very similar to what social media platforms are today, where you offer a free product, but you make your money on the advertising side. And I always found it interesting that, particularly in small, medium-sized markets, that advertisers, they weren't using advertising agencies. They just weren't that sophisticated yet. But often they'd want to lead with facts and figures, and they wanted to talk about what they thought people would be most impressed with. So if it was a car dealership, it might be how many cars they have in inventory or how many awards they've won or things like that. And it was a common refrain. And often I could see that advertising wasn't working as well as it should. And I never was able to really put my finger on it until I got a great promotion in the mid-90s. I got promoted to run the radio networks for the Toronto Blue Jays and Toronto Maple Leafs in Toronto. So we looked after their national broadcasts. And that's where I first got my opportunity to be dealing with national advertisers and national agencies. And what struck me is that almost all of the great advertising that worked, where the clients were really happy, really were all based on emotion. They had hardly anything to do with facts and figures. And that really struck me because I just remember from, my earlier career in radio that this seemed so odd, but fascinating. And so I really decided to get into it, and I became frankly obsessed with understanding human behavior. And so I devoured books on psychology and neuroscience and behavioral economics. And I took some courses, and I just found it absolutely fascinating. And we can get into this a little later on in the discussion about, why emotion is the gate, is the opener of the mind. And frankly, the facts and figures, that goes to the new mind is what holds you back. So eventually I ended up buying my first radio station myself and using that core concept to work with our advertisers. And we had a small mechanic that worked out of a just starting a new business, worked out of a really small shop. He had 2 bays, and him and his wife were going to run this mechanic shop. And he wanted to talk about this diagnostic equipment that he had just purchased that was quite expensive. And I wanted to use some of these insights that I'd learned. And I said, no, his name was Ted. I said, Ted, no, we're going to talk about you, and we're going to talk about what makes you different and what's going on in your life. And they started talking about, and his wife was there. Her name was Benita. She said, you know what? My biggest problem with Ted is he always fixes everybody else's car before he fixes mine. And I thought that's the opening. So the idea was that Ted, puts his customers first, and he has a big heart, and he fixes everybody's car except Benita's. So that became a talk line. And that radio campaign is famous around where I came from because it lasted for 20 years. And it was this banter back and forth. And he went from like 2 bays to 20 bays, exited later on, very successful business. So that's when I knew I was onto something.
That's such a great story that brings that to life. And I think, for there are many Teds in the world because we want to talk about the technical specs of our equipment and like you said, the facts, the stats, the figures. When we learn that it is based on emotion, all of a sudden we feel like we have a lot less to grab onto.
Mhm.
So, how have you approached that in terms of, you've yourself, your work has been about translating a lot of this science into meaningful strategy, which that story just illustrated. But how do you get over that initial hurdle of, okay, we're going to make an emotional appeal to our customers? Because a lot of times people hear those words and all they think is, we're going to spend money and I'm not gonna know what I'm getting, how it's working, in the same way that sometimes the stats provide almost a false sense of comfort.
Absolutely. And you know what? That was a challenge. That was my challenge for a long time. And over the years, having, like I said, owned my own radio stations, and we had, 30, 40 salespeople working in different markets. I did the training for it. And it was always trying to get some of these things across. But it wasn't until I figured out, and this is what the book is based on, I came up with this metaphor that I could explain to people in a relatively short period of time, 15, 20 minutes, that all of a sudden would seem to drop their pushback on the fact that, maybe there's something beyond just this, this guy saying that we got to use emotion instead of facts and figures. And it was just the metaphor, and it's the reason the book is called The Divided Brain, is because the metaphor is 2 gears in your head. The larger gear, the old brain, really that is the part of the brain that we've taken from our ancestors and for animals going back to the beginning of time, the lizard brain, and that's where all of our automatic functions happen. And through evolution, it's a masterpiece of evolution, how that part of the brain works. It can do so many things at the same time, all subconsciously, but it really drives the bus. And the other thing I learned through research was that decisions are made there at a subconscious level before what we call our new brain, which is the neocortex, the newer addition to the brain that we have in terms of evolution. It hasn't been around that long. And that's where we do our reasoning, and that's where we, think things through a little bit. But the de facto position for that new brain is not necessarily to challenge the old brain. It's more to rationalize what that old brain decision is. And so it's a 1-2 step dance in terms of the way decisions are made. And it's all driven by the larger gear. That big gear is driving at the old brain. And then the new brain tries to catch up. And if you can then supply the new brain with some facts and figures, because it wants to rationalize the decision the old brain made, then you've really got a really good 1-2 punch. So, again, start with that emotion. And that's what I couldn't figure out again when I was in Toronto and I started seeing that Ford and General Motors they weren't promoting horsepower. They were talking about that feeling you get about driving the car and how exhilarated it makes you feel. And we had a lot of beer advertisers. People who you've been to Canada, you will know Molson's and Labatt's. They were huge advertisers with us. But they never talked about the hops or the water or anything like that. It was all the lifestyle, the feeling that you get, how your status is within your group. And I was able to communicate that through this large brain, small brain, gear process in a way that people could understand it, just doing it on a napkin or on a whiteboard. And that's when I said, you know what, I might have a book here.
On Brand will be right back after this. Now, back to the show. So, as you talk about the divided brain, and if someone's listening and thinking, oh boy, I wonder if we're accidentally talking to the wrong part of our customer's brain, is there a quick assessment that you might be able to tell if you're on the right or the wrong track?
Well, the first question I would ask somebody, particularly if they're new to branding or they have been around for a while, but they're not getting the results they want, is how is your product or service or whatever it may be that you're promoting, how does it make people feel? And that often stops them in their tracks because they're not expecting that, or they never really kind of think about how does it make them feel? What is it giving them in terms of an emotional feeling? And that stumps them a lot. And there's a process that, through the training, and we talk about it in the book, where we call it a brand value canvas, where you can go through an exercise of trying to separate the facts and the features from things like pain points, but also how is this going to make people feel? And then what we do is we'll peel the onion back more and say a lot of these feelings people won't even admit that they're looking for them, especially when it comes to things like status. People won't admit that they're buying this to increase their status in the world, for example, but they are. We all are, and the beauty of explaining it in the terms of the old brain and new brain is that it makes perfect logical sense that our old brain works that way, because throughout evolution, all of those things really were key in keeping us alive. Now we're in the modern world now, so it's not as reflective as the way we were designed as as a species, but when you look at it through the lens of understanding, and again, the book gets into a lot more detail on this about why, how the old brain, why it wants to conserve energy, and why it wants immediate gratification, and why it's resilient to change, and why it's selfish, and why it's tribal. These are all things that are, again, built in to our brain through evolution, not necessarily from what we learn. The new brain is what we learn, and that is the things that we get through the exposure that we have in our environment. And again, these two work together. But the thing people can't make any mistake about is that the decisions that we make, no matter what, could be what you had for breakfast this morning or what you think you're going to do tomorrow or the day after, is made in the old brain first at a subconscious level. And the science is very strong on this through different studies and brain scans and so on. So I don't want to get into any of the technical stuff here, but anyone who's familiar with also Daniel Kahneman's, the dual system, or the triune brain model, or Jonathan Haidt's, the rider and the elephant, will understand if these are a lot of the basis for what I talk about.
So, as you talk about that, you talk about some of this kind of grounded behavioral psychology that is valuable to marketers, to brand builders, and has always needed to be better understood than it is. But I wonder too about the moment that we find ourselves in now, and needing to understand that more than ever, because the modern consumer is overwhelmed when it comes to their attention processing systems, so much information coming at them constantly, that I would think that they're relying on the the old brain quick hit or quick decision to navigate the kind of fire hose of information coming at us today. How does all of this, meet the moment?
Well, you're absolutely right. All of these things that I'm talking about, where they sometimes, from a marketing and branding point of view, or just from the way we communicate, is the way to open up a conversation through emotion. But there's a lot of baggage that in our modern world that comes with that. We inherently have a lot of cognitive biases that, again, have been wired into us that at one point made us flourish, but now work against us, and logical fallacies. And there's a whole bunch of them. Our old brain is very much a pattern. It finds patterns in everything. It's called patternicity. We talk about that a lot. And today it can find patterns where none exist, and because it has to resolve, and that's what can lead us astray often in the modern world, particularly through social media. And if you look at how we ingest our news and information now, is the old brain is constantly trying to recognize patterns to see if there's a threat there. And unless the new brain engages, and I talk about this in the book, there actually is a whole chapter on, I don't like to use the word critical thinking, but there's no other way to say it. Is that sometimes you have to engage that new brain, and you can through just thinking about thinking through, it's, again, I don't want to get into technical terms, but things like metacognition, where you can really put the brakes on and say, listen, is everything that I'm being exposed to here is this, are they just talking to my old brain? And if you understand the way this metaphor works, it's easy for you to say, yes, aha, I know what's going on now. They're hitting these hot buttons in my old brain. And you can, you're in a better position to put the brakes on and say, I'm going to ingest things a little differently here. And I'm going to understand that there's errors in the way we think today. And maybe I can go through some steps to help myself think more logically and critically through this.
You talk about critical thinking and the modern consumer, and I, I I don't know that there is an answer, but I wonder too where we're at on, because I think for quite a while it has been a lot of media is happening to us, and we didn't exactly know why in terms of the information that we were consuming. But I feel like, and again, I don't know where in the curve moving through this that we are, but it seems like there's a greater conversation of, I know that my algorithm's only showing me this. And I don't know that we'll, I don't know again where we are in that or moving through that, but it seems like that's sort of a moving target in its own way, the modern consumer and their media and information diet as well.
Well, that's the challenge that our society faces today, not only in marketing and advertising, but virtually through everything. And AI now is just expounding on it because, I mentioned earlier that I spent decades studying this stuff, and I'm not a doctor. I don't have a PhD. I'm just fascinated by it, and I've been able to translate this into results for the business that I was in, but AI today understands this way better than even I do. And they can talk to the old brain directly, and they can do it in a tone and way that is very hard for people to even perceive unless they have awareness, unless they have knowledge. And again, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. And that's why I did put a part in it about critical thinking in that, because to me, this is one of the few things that people can actually do to say, hey, listen, maybe I have to be a little bit more, embrace skepticism maybe a little bit more and think could this be my two gears that are getting, locked together here? Is it time for me to press the clutch in and talk to my new brain and, assess the sources? What's the credibility? What are the motives behind some of the stuff that I'm hearing? And once you do that, then you really start getting into a habit. It becomes an easy habit to start flagging. And, certainly with my friends and family, everybody will refer to, when they hear something, especially if it sounds like it's a little out there, they'll come back to the divided brain. Oh, that's the old brain playing a trick on us, and they pick up on it really quick. So it does have some practical value beyond that to just keep us a little bit grounded, but it's not easy. Because people, again, these things are so inherently built into us, and they're so part of our intuition and what makes us who we are today for all the right reasons, that the hardest thing to do is really to check your ego. You have to really check your ego and say, can I actually maybe be wrong? Or could I be manipulated with what I'm being presented? And when you start asking questions like that and you're big enough to say, maybe I am, then all of a sudden things start to get clearer.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so important. And as we talk about, the comfort of data, facts, figures, and the, scariness of relying on emotional appeals. And the science makes it more clear, but it too can be overwhelming. So if someone was to take one actionable next step from this of I'm going to go do something differently, or at least think about what we're saying, what would you tell folks to do?
Well, probably the thing I just mentioned a while ago is be prepared to just check your ego and to say, because we all think that everybody else is being duped, but I'm not. And that is unfortunately, one of the biggest roadblocks. And Richard Feynman, the great physicist, I loved one of his lines, and I have it in my book. And he says the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, but you're the easiest person to
Yeah.
fool.
Oh, yeah.
And it's so true. And especially with what he was talking about, is we are easy to fool. And again, if you understand why we were easy to fool and why we evolved that way and why it makes so much sense, but it doesn't make sense in the current world we're in, you do have a lever. You can actually say, listen, I'm going to look at this a little differently.
That is so important, and a good reminder as well. Well, let's shift gears from the brain science to something a little easier. Paul, I wonder if you'd tell us about a brand that has made you smile recently.
Oh, I mean, I'm such a fan of seeing anything that is old come back into light in a new way. So often, what makes me smile is actually a lot of the older advertisers that are still using these same techniques today. And I know it might not sound like a great answer for a new product, but yeah, obviously still listen to a lot of radio when I'm in my car and watching television, and I'm just a fan of that medium. And it's great to see things like, again, McDonald's and a lot of other ones, just again talking to the heart and not to the head, and seeing that these companies through all of these years can succeed. So. Uh, but what bothers me probably more is when I hear newer brands talking about facts and features, and I'm going, you know what, they're not going to be around very long.
Well, that is important insight. Yeah. And that's why I think sometimes we look at, the big McDonald's of the world, and we're quick to point out that they have this. We're quick to ascribe all the success to the size of the organization and their budget. And what they're really doing is telling compelling stories. And
Mhm.
that they keep doing that too, I think is kind of remarkable. And we can learn and apply some of those even at smaller organizations as well. Paul,
Absolutely. That was my awakening in the
yeah.
90s.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where can we send folks to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Well, again, keeping things simple for the old brain, the best place to go to is my website, and it's paullarche.com, Larche. And there's more information on the book there. If you wanted to order it, you could. If you wanted to download the first chapter, you can see it. And I also have some PDFs that people could download that explain this in a little bit more detail, just see if they're interested in it. But if they wanted to pick up the book, that would be great. I also speak a lot at conferences about this, and so they can find out more information about that. And I'm just really enjoying it because I'm finding that people are really open to this conversation, particularly in the modern world with AI on our doorstep.
Absolutely. Well, we will link up to all of that in our show notes, which folks can find at onbrandpodcast.com. Paul Larche, thanks for being on brand with us.
Thank you, Nick. It was my pleasure.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.